West Seattle, born and raised. He grew up by the Fauntleroy Ferry and has been coming to Westwood Barnes & Noble in this building since it opened.
Hey, thank you all for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. It's awesome turnout, and I hope you enjoy the talk. And thanks to the Historical Society for having me today, and also thanks to Barnes & Noble as well. So yeah, I'm Joe Gustav. I'm the author of In Deep, the story of global diving and salvage. And as mentioned, this is a corporate history about global diving commemorating the company's 35th anniversary. Global Diving is a West Seattle company, has been from the start, and you can find them right down West Marginal Way under the bridge. So because this is kind of a different book than you've had in the series, I'm going to approach this talk a little bit in a different way. I'm not going to read from my book. I'm more going to just focus on history. I also have an article coming out in September in Sea Chest, which is the quarterly journal for the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society. And that article focuses on the history of commercial diving in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm going to start by kind of talking about that, providing context from pretty much 1800s on up to the 1970s, and then we'll get to Global's formation and start talking about what Global's done. And when I'm talking about Global, I'm just kind of going to do the greatest hits, talk about the projects I enjoyed writing about the most and that I think are the most interesting. There's a lot of, these might seem like really disparate projects from all over the world, and they're doing different things, but when you read about, and if you want to read about in the book, you can do so. Read about the outside forces, the legislation, the industry trends, things of that nature that kind of made these jobs happen when they did. It all lines up really well, or at least it did when I read it. I like to think. So, Global Diving, it's a big company. It's internationally known. It's a really important company, but you might not have heard of them. And you might not know too much about the commercial diving industry, and I sure didn't when I started this project. And I think a big reason for that is all the work they do, you probably don't see. It all happens underwater, but it's really crucial to our everyday life, keeping boats afloat for shipping, for transportation, maintaining our infrastructure, bridges, dams, and even keeping gas in our cars too, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So, what is commercial diving? I think a good way to start with that is to talk about what it's not. So Robert, if you would get to the next slide. It's not that. It's not Clive Cussler. Some of the guys might like to think it's as dashing as that, but it's a little different. It's also not the next slide. Though that looks like a lot of fun, and I highly recommend scuba diving. I go myself. But no, it's next slide, please. That's what it's like. It's welding underwater. It's doing carpentry. As the guys like to say, diving is just the mode of transportation. It's really how good you are as a diver is determined by what you can do underwater across a lot of different disciplines. And your troubleshooting, your problem solving is crucial because it all comes down to that one guy working in the water on that project. It's all on their shoulders. And this is a tough job, and it's performed by tough men and women. And it's also, I don't want to say, let me see how to put this. Well, you're doing something you're not supposed to do in a couple different ways. You're a visitor to this environment underwater, and you're breathing underwater, and that's not something we're supposed to be able to do. But we figured it out. It's a really safe profession, and especially for Global, they take great precautions for their people. That's paramount. And it's just an incredible profession, and it's a hard one. And Tim, when you come up, I'm going to ask you why people do this job, because I don't think you could get me to do it for all the money in the world. So, diving as a discipline has been around for a long time. Alexander the Great supposedly lowered in a glass diving bell underwater. There were military divers in the Trojan War. Chinese pearl divers were probably the first divers, and that happened, in 2000 BC, if not earlier. And Leonardo da Vinci himself sketched out a bunch of early designs for diving apparatus, for breathing underwater. But it wasn't until the 1830s and a gentleman named Augustus over in Germany that we had the breathing method that we have now, the closed dive helmet with a big long hose that goes up to the surface to an air compressor and pumps air below the surface to the person working below. And not too long after that, we had commercial diving in the Pacific Northwest. So next slide, Robert. Thank you. So basically, where there's water, there's divers. It's really interconnected with the rising maritime industry, which is often a part of rising populations, more infrastructure needs, and more business. So these early divers, they were self-made entrepreneurs, and they were risking life and limb to seize opportunity as they found it. So they're usually freelancers working in two-man teams. You'd have the diver, the guy with the gear going down, and they'd have what's called a tender up on the surface. And this was the person making sure everything's okay, tending the air compressor, laying hose down as need be, and then helping them back up. Yes, I'll explain.
This is when? Time frame or approximate time frame?
Sure. So this is early 1900s. I think this picture itself is probably 1910, 1920, and I'll get to just a minute who those folks are. Thanks for asking. So yeah, freelancers working in two-man teams. They didn't have formal training. They didn't go to school for this. One guy knew it and passed it down. Usually the tender was kind of an apprentice to the diver. And so it made sense that oftentimes these two-man teams were father and son. And so here's an example of some important dive figures here in the Pacific Northwest. These are the Finches. In the middle is Henry Finch. On the right is his son, Henry Finch Jr. And on the left, I believe that's Tom. And so the Finches did a lot of work around the waterfront here in Seattle in the 1910s, 1920s, in that range. Henry made his fortune up in Alaska. There was a big wreck called the SS Islander. There's a lot of gold bullion, and he went and got it. And when he made his fortune, he took it back with him to Seattle, started Henry Finch and Sons. And so they worked on the waterfront. They're laying water and sewage mains that apparently 3 other companies couldn't get it done, but they could. And I want to mention one other diver who helped on that job. Her name was Eileen McKee Bryant. There weren't too many women divers at the time, and she was crucial in getting this job done. So I just wanted to give her a mention. Another claim to fame for Henry Finch Sr., he set the dive record. He was under 38 feet for over 5 hours on the job. And when I tell you what the guys do now, that might not seem as impressive, but back then, that was a big deal. So, and hold on just a sec. Another father-son pair that's worth noting is Walter and Art McCrae. They were around the same time period. Walter was a Scottish immigrant who settled here in Puget Sound, an apprentice as a salvage diver, and then eventually went into business for himself. And so, as I mentioned, divers they're going to a different world that's here on Earth, going underwater to where the rest of us don't get to go. And so at this time period, divers were the closest thing they had to astronauts, which leads me to a good quote from Global Diving. They like to say around the company, global diving because even astronauts need a hero. So because they were, such adventurers, they can make national headlines. So if you hit the next slide here. So this is a national headline Walter McCrae made. This is from the St. Petersburg Evening Independent in 1922. And as it says, diver battles huge octopus. And this was front page news across the country. Basically what happened, a big octopus latched onto him, threatened to cut off his air supply. He couldn't grab his knife. He alerted his tender up above, got a crowbar to keep the octopus from cutting off his air supply as he made his way to the surface. And once he got up there, the octopus had enough, jumped off, and went back down. But according to this story, it is, quote, one of the largest ever seen in these waters. For Walter McCrae, this was one of several brushes with death, and unfortunately eventually caught up with him on a job in Aberdeen in 1934. He died about 50 feet underwater, and it was actually his son Art had to go down and get his body and bring it back to the surface. Next slide, please. And that's Art McCrae right there, and he took over the family business and kept it going and became a pretty important figure himself, working on some really important projects in the 1930s. Down the Columbia River, his company helped on the construction of Grand Coulee Dam, and also when the Tacoma Narrows Bridge went down, he was one of the main salvage divers on that job. And so, you know, as Art kept the business going, the projects kept getting bigger, they kept getting more important, and that was true for the dive industry as a whole, especially as we got into World War II. Next slide, thank you. So here's Harbor Island, and Harbor Island, when it was built in 1909, was the largest artificial island in the world, and as we got into World War II, it was humming. There were about 5,000 people employed at Todd Pacific and Lockheed shipyards. These were the dominant shipbuilding and repair yards in the Northwest at the time. And there was work outside of there too. You know, as more people came to town, came to Seattle and the surrounding suburbs to work at Boeing, other plants for the maritime industry, other industries, we needed more infrastructure. We needed bridges, we needed other stuff. There was a lot of work for divers. And so there's just one kind of side note I like to mention too. So, you know, some of these divers, they worked hard. They also like to live hard lives. And so apparently around 11:50 p.m. on Harbor Island at the end of shift, you'd hear the tires squealing, the gravel flying as the divers and their shipyard compatriots would make their way to the taverns on Harbor Island. One called the Blue Eagle and another Nifty's, which apparently was famous for its whiskey and pancakes. And I don't know if those are separate things you enjoy at the same time or... So yeah, so the Warriors, they were good. They were good for divers. But as the 60s rolled around, this generation of divers, they began hanging up their dry suits. It's hard work. You can't do it forever. But there's still no shortage of dive work. So that's why in 1968, a couple divers opened the Divers Institute of Technology in Ballard, DIT for short. And that's still here today. It was the first of its kind, a private, for-profit institution, but you could earn a nationally recognized certificate in diving. And today it's internationally recognized. So there's a real changing of the times here. You know, it lowered the barrier of entry into this industry. You didn't need to know somebody. You didn't have to have, you know, a familial relation or a gracious mentor to teach you the trade. You could go to school and get your degree in diving and then go to work. I also just one of the founders of DIT, I'd like to mention, a gentleman named Leiter Hockett. Next slide. That's him. He's in the middle in the dive gear there. This is a job in Grays Harbor in 1948. So Leiter was an amazing guy, a member of the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society and author himself. If you can ever pick up his book, Waterwork, I highly recommend it. It's over 40 years of his work in the industry, and the guy did everything. And also, that's just a cool picture, so I wanted to throw that up there. So as these fast and loose times were ending for divers, big maritime contractors, they needed consistent, reliable dive work. They needed whole teams of divers for lengthy projects on federal contracts. These were deep projects. They had their own special bonding and insurance, and you need work plans and safety records. You really need a whole team, if not a whole company, to get these big projects. And so that brings us up to Crowley Environmental Services, CES for short. So Crowley Maritime's a big marine services company. They needed their own dive team. And so one reason for that was in 1969, a thing called the National Environmental Policy Act was passed by Congress, and that required companies to clean up maritime oil spills. So Crowley, they wanted to get in on this, so they needed people to go clean up oil. And they also need people to go salvage vessels, and why not have an in-house diving team too? So they came up with CES, and they hired some young DIT graduates to come start this unit. These guys pretty much got to learn how to run a business there. They were doing all the billing, the invoicing, making these projects happening. And next slide, please, Robert. Here's a few of those guys. I just want to mention a few because it's from Crowley Environmental that Global Diving was formed. 7 of those guys broke off and started their own company. One guy who's not pictured is John Graham. He's a local guy. He's from Arbor Heights, and he was a crucial figure in Global's history. A couple guys up there are Tom Davis, Greg Harum, and the guy at the wheel is Tim Beaver, and he's co-founder and owner of Global Diving. He's here with us today. So I wanted to bring Tim up to tell you firsthand a little bit about his time at Crowley, this rambunctious group of guys that were CES, and then also breaking off to start Global. Oh, so from the way I heard, you guys were kind of a rowdy crew, and then, do you have maybe a story about you guys?
What happened was, I'll back up just a little bit. Crowley Maritime and Marine Power and Electric and a company called Crosby and Overton actually formed Crowley Environmental Services. It was originally called Marine Oil Pickup Service, MOPS. And in those days, there was a lot of oil spilled. I mean, it was just part of the deal. The oil was sort of coming down the river all the time, and ships fueled up and they spilled it over the side. It was just part of the program. And so they passed a law against it, and nobody really knew how to clean it up, to be honest. We sort of figured it out. And so there was a young group of people. We were on Harbor Island, put together by an old guy. He was probably 32, and he was ex-Coast Guard, Barry Paulson, the big picture, BP, anyway, that was his name. And so he hired us all, and we were youngsters. We were all in our 20s, and we were full of piss and vinegar and creating problems for him every day. But nobody could do much about it because nobody else would be willing to go under the docks, pull the booms around, and figure things out and do what just make it up as you go. So that's how the group came together. We became pretty good friends. The real money was made in the diving side, but there wasn't that much of it. And so I eventually gravitated to that because there's more money per hour and a little more glamour, if you can believe it. And so a group of us divers got together, and at some point we kind of outgrew the little pigeonhole they had us in, and people started asking us to do the work because at that point Crowley had bought out Costly and Overtime and the other guys, and so Crowley was trying to take this thing down kind of a hazardous materials recovery path, and we were more interested in salvaging sunken barges and boats and things like that. So we split away, blatantly stole the clients from, as every startup company does, and it went from there.
From what I understand, they also hired a new supervisor. You guys didn't like.
Oh yeah, Jerry Plank. Jerry Plank came from the Army. He was an Army, underwater commando guy. The kind of guy that popped out of a torpedo chute off of Vietnam, swam to the beach, blew up a few bridges, and then swam back out. I mean, he was a nutcase. I liked him and everything, but he didn't quite fit the mold we were in. So he helped in the process of splitting apart. Gave us another reason.
Great. And while I've got you up here, Tim, so as I mentioned, I just wanted to ask you, what is it about diving that keeps guys going back in the water for decades to do this job?
Well, once you see it, once you are around it, and you see the guys go underwater, you realize that you're dealing with the best of the best. I think people who understand boats, they understand the weather. They have to take you have to be a pretty good pretty good sailor. You got to be a pretty good deckhand. You got to be a pretty good bosun. You've got to know all the trades, and then you can get in the water. And there's no hiding failure. You go down there and it doesn't work, or you don't get the job done. Well, you come back up and the job's not done. They don't want a bunch of excuses, and it's hard to. They can't see what you're doing, and so that's all it is to them. You come back up and say, well, I couldn't do it because of all these reasons, and they just say, well, you didn't do it. Find somebody who can. So you go into water and you get it done by hook or by crook, and it builds up in your blood, and it gets you you enjoy that, and you enjoy kind of the limelight. You're the guy. You're at the end of the hose. You're calling all the shots. You're telling the crane whether to swing left or right. You're telling them when to start pumping concrete. You're telling them whether to fill the lift bag. You're telling them everything. And it's a challenge. And you're doing it basically with your eyes closed, standing on your head. And not everybody can do it. So once you get good at it, it's really fun. I mean, there's nothing like it.
It's awesome. Thank you, Tim.
Okay.
And so when Global broke off from Crowley, got their office on Harbor Island, it was a tough go of it at the start. Their suits had patches, wasn't the best gear. Everyone took a turn during the work week wearing this big oversized jacket with a lot of pockets and going up to Shakey's Buffet on 35th and taking as much chicken and rolls as they could and bringing it back for the rest of the guys. But it was work at Todd Pacific Shipyard on Harbor Island that really saved them. It wasn't glamorous work, to say the least. It was patching old dry docks that just couldn't quite stay afloat. Dry docks allow you to work on boats when they need repairs. They're floating, they can be raised and lowered in the water. And so, it's scraping barnacles by hand, driving sledgehammers. Tim, you described it as working on the ceiling of your living room and trying to sledgehammer up there. But the divers kept getting work. They were there at a moment's notice. They were reliable. They recognized problems before they arose. They worked hard. They provided good customer service, and they kept getting asked back. And they got recommendations, and the business grew from there. Next slide, please. So that's another good picture of Tim and John Graham there raising, I believe, a seaplane. Yep.
Lake Buccaneer.
That's right, Lake Buccaneer. So this was emblematic of the values that drive Global to this day. And these values were formalized in the 1990s, the three key ones: safety, quality of service, and growth. These things have motivated Global every step of the way, from what projects they choose, what risks they take project-wise, to how they get the projects done. And so from here, I'm just going to do kind of the greatest hits, talk about some projects you guys might have even heard of, and show off some cool pictures. So next, please. So the Exxon Valdez in 1989, when a big oil tanker ran aground in Prince William Sound up in Alaska and spilled 11 million gallons of oil across 1,300 miles of coastline. So at the time, that was the biggest oil spill in U.S. history. And it was a big cleanup effort. But Global was there to help, and they were one of the first companies subcontracted to help. They were up there for a year and a half. Next slide. And so there's some of the guys working on the salvage, pumping oil out basically to get it out of there, as well as helping clean up the oil that spilled everywhere. And for Global, this was a milestone project. This was their first big chunk of cash. Apparently they had a great Christmas party at Salty's that year, one for the ages, but also allowed them to upgrade their equipment and take on bigger projects, keep rolling it up. So to move ahead in the timeline a little bit, we're going to go to 1997. This is probably my favorite project to write about. Thank you. And it was all about these little $20 gold coins that hadn't seen the light of day since 1865. So this project was treasure hunting, basically. this steamship called the Brother Jonathan went down in a big storm in 1865 right off of Crescent City in Northern California. And it was on its way to the Northwest Territories. So 225 people died when it went down, including the governor of Washington Territory, A.G. Henry. But as the ship sank, it took with it a whole lot of cash. Treaty payments for tribes, payroll for the U.S. Army, and cash for federal banks. So it just sat there until 1993. This company called Deep Sea Research found it on sonar. And after a protracted legal battle with the state of California, they got the rights to go down and get what was there. And yeah, it was $20 gold coins was what they were looking for. So for Global, this was a really huge project and a big risk for the company business-wise because it required a different form of diving. And as I was learning about commercial diving, this is the thing that really made me say, wow, and also that is not the career for me. So Global had to do saturation diving to complete this project. So basically, you know, as anyone who's scuba dived before, when you get to a certain depth, stay down for a while, you have to slowly come back up to decompress because of all the nitrogen in your system. And if you come up too quick, you can really hurt yourself. So for commercial divers working at deep depths like that's kind of a time issue. You can go down, but coming back up can take hours. And that's a lot of time wasted on a project and a lot of money lost for the company. So the way to get around that, sorry, go ahead.
What are we calling a deep depth?
Oh, a couple 100 feet, 100 to 100 and above, really, yeah. Thank you. So to combat this, basically what you do is a thing called saturation diving, where you've got usually two divers who are working on a job. They trade off the work, and you put them to pressure, and they stay in pressure until the job is done. Next one, please. So this is the dive bell. This is what's going to lower and raise the divers. It's at the pressure they'll be working at. And it goes down to the job, the divers swim out, they come back in, and it raises them back up, and it connects to, next slide please, the living chamber. So this lives on a barge above the job site. It's at the pressure they're working at. And the divers live in that. There's two guys, you know, one in the bell, goes out, swims, comes back up, the other guy gets ready to work. And they trade off, and they live in that thing till the job's done. So it can be a month, it can be 55 days, and it's just two guys. And if you click on the next slide, please, that's what it looked like on the Brother Jonathan. So it's an interesting way to make a living, I think. Your food, your laundry, everything's provided to you. The crew gives it to you in airlocks. They try really hard on the food, but because of the decrease or the air pressure, it desensitizes your taste buds. These guys are just dousing everything in hot sauce to try to make it taste like something. Not a ton of talking because there's a ton of helium in the air, so you just sound like Donald Duck. So lots of reading, Nerf basketball, and just waiting till you go to work. But for the guys who dive and who do this is like the pinnacle of commercial dive work. There's a saying, sat is where it's at. The best guys get to do this. They get the biggest paychecks and get to buy the biggest trucks afterwards. It's really a big deal to do this kind of work. And for Global, you know, it meant a big investment into this equipment, a new thing, but they did it very successfully. They recovered over 1,200 coins on this job. Those coins got $5 million at auction, and one flawed coin had an inverted date on it, got $115,000 on its own. So next one, please. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit to one a little bit closer to home. This is the 520 bridge. Global helped replace anchor cables on the bridge in 1999. This was a big project for Global as well. It was their first time as a prime contractor on a big marine construction project. So they were heading it up. They weren't working for someone else. So this was an all-hands effort. It also had some interesting bureaucracy, I guess, with the Department of Transportation. For a bridge job on a floating bridge, Tim, you had the pleasure of becoming certified in erosion and soil stormwater management, which seems very necessary on a lake. So next slide. And I wish Devin was here. He'd love seeing this. That's the current president of the company, Devin Grennan, working on the cable replacement. So they're actually working inside the pontoons at 520. It was hot, it was humid. Some people felt they were in over their heads on this project, but they got the job done, and it was a big win for Global. Next one. So this one, some of you folks might have seen this. That's right by Seacrest, down Alki. So in 2002, a 63-year-old recently restored Boeing 307 had to make a crash landing right in Elliott Bay, not too far from here, really. Basically, the plane had issues with its landing gear. As the pilots were trying to figure it out, they ran out of fuel, and they had to land it in the water. Everyone was okay. No one was hurt. I read a Seattle Times article, said one guy came out with his briefcase, just walked on the wing like he was about to catch a taxi. But it made for quite the spectacle. Next slide, Robert. So Global was called to help. There's a crane lifting up the plane right there. And next slide. And there's the Global crew standing with it as it was raised in the water. 2004. The hurricane started hitting in the Gulf of Mexico, and down there's a lot of oil wells. And as the hurricanes hit, a lot of those wells went down, or the platforms above the wells went down. So the first project Global was called to work on was for Hurricane Ivan. There's this oil platform that went down. It had these big, expensive, heavy legs that the company needed to get up. So that's actually the barge right there and the chains they used to try to bring up those legs. And it was from that job that Global was noticed by a company called Noble Energy. And Noble Energy brought in Global to help after Hurricane Katrina and then Hurricane Rita later in the next year. Some eyebrows were raised. There were a lot of dive companies down in the Gulf of Mexico already. So why are they bringing in these guys from the Pacific Northwest? Well, the reason was Global is a salvage company, and they wanted salvagers, who could do saturation diving, because these legs were way down there, a few hundred feet. And the oil platforms, too, that they're working on, to show you kind of the scale. There's a downed oil platform right there. So that thing should be a lot higher off the water. Next one, Robert. So all those black dots are oil platforms that were affected. So a really unfortunate disaster, but helped out Global quite a lot of work for the company. Global performed over 140,000 dive hours in the Gulf of Mexico, assisting on those without a single time loss incident. So commitment to safety there. And a couple cool things I want to mention too. So to help out the guys while they were working, they hired a Hollywood lighting technician to rig up lights for them. So they had Hollywood grade lighting to help illuminate the jobs. Also, next one here. So that's a diver playing tic-tac-toe with an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle. So by this time, ROVs are being used a lot, carrying live streams, going and doing work. They're just, I guess, drones of the sea. You operate them from above, and they're machines that will go down and either scope out something or help out. So here's a diver playing tic-tac-toe. This was a big deal. A lot of people considered this risky to have humans and ROVs working side by side. So when these pictures really resonate around the industry. I don't know who won though. And so after these projects, Global, once again, a lot more capital, able to do bigger and better projects and to even go deeper than ever before. Next one, please. So this may not look like much, but this was the deepest project Global been a part of. And this is in New York City. This project was called Shaft 6 after part of an aqueduct. So basically, you know, New York City's got a really remarkable aqueduct system that brings water from, you know, up to 100 miles away to go to provide water for, you know, 20 million people in the city and around the area. And a lot of New Yorkers and anyone who's been there too will tell you, you know, the water tastes really good. It's good water. But one of these aqueducts was leaking up to 30 million gallons of water a day. So people's basements were flooding on a perfectly dry day. And the city needed to fix that. But the problem was, to do the fix, you have to drain the aqueduct. Well, you can't drain an aqueduct for a long period of time. There's just too many people dependent on it. So what they did was they needed a diving company to basically go down one of these shafts, this part of the aqueduct, make the preparations for the repair so that when they did drain it, it was a minimal amount of time and they could get it done quickly. So Global ended up doing that. So Shaft 6, let's see here. Okay, so this is kind of the idea. So what you saw on the slide before, that's them getting the bell ready, so what lowers the divers. Really, as you could see in that past one, that's not a lot of area to work in. It's pretty narrow. And so the divers would go out of the bell, and they would work in that corridor to put in this huge plug, which I'll show you in a couple slides. But they were going 720 feet below the surface. So to put that in perspective, the Space Needle's 680 something feet. So yeah, put the Space Needle underground, go a bit further. That's how deep these divers were working. So next one. So obviously a lot of preparation on this job, a lot of bonding. So Global, as part of it, had to make a mock-up of part of the job to prepare and go through everything. So there's part of it at Todd Shipyard on Harbor Island, and it took, next one please. So there's a couple guys standing with the plug they ended up putting in, which was the most complicated task involved. There were a lot of tasks involved in this project, but that's a 23,000 pound mechanical plug that would allow the shaft to be drained, and Global put that in. So the biggest compliment Global got on the job, though, and it took about 5 years, seasonal work, you know, as they could drain it or shut off water to do the jobs. But the biggest compliment Global got was they were asked to go do work in the dry. So not do dry diving work, but go do just construction work down there when it was drained, because the prime contractor trusted their work so much and wanted to ensure the job was done right. Next one, please. So since then, Global's been doing even bigger projects. So some of you might recognize this, the Coasta Concordia, the cruise ship that ran aground in Italy. It was the largest salvage job in history in terms of tonnage. So the ship's 114,000 tons. Global performed 1,800 dives on this. They were the last diving subcontractor to leave before the ship was uprighted in the winter of 2013. And there's also a big project Global worked on close to home too. The Skagit River Bridge, I-5 up by Bellingham, that collapsed after a truck struck a support beam. So Global was working 24 hours a day for 13 days to provide diving and salvage support on that. This isn't a job you just like or that you want to do for a few years before you move on to something else. You have to be really passionate about it, especially to be successful at it, and these men and women certainly are.